depths I cry to you. In darkest places I will call. Incline your ear to me anew, and hear my cry for mercy, Lord. I will wait for you, I will wait for you. On your word I will rely. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, till my soul is satisfied. Now he has come to make a way, and God himself has paid the price, that all who trust in him today find healing in his sacrifice. I will wait for you, I will wait for you, through the storm and through the night. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, for your love is my delight. I will wait for you, I will wait for you, through the storm and through the night. I will wait for you, surely wait for you, for your love is my delight.
Hello, and welcome to The Search with Clint and Shahe. My name is Shahe Jurgen, and with me is Clinton DeFrance, and this is our 25th Torah episode. In fact, this is the last installment of our Torah series. A couple of weeks ago, we sort of put out a petition for anyone who'd like to send us any questions based on some of the things we've been discussing over the last several months about the Torah, or maybe a Torah question that you have that we did not cover in our survey of these 5 books of Moses. We were given a great list of questions, too many that we would be able to entirely cover in detail in one session like this. And so what we've decided to do tonight is to take the questions and to sort of put them into 3 blocks or 3 categories. The first is going to deal with interpretive issues, particularly about the Genesis prologue, or Genesis 1 through 11. The second is going to revisit a topic that Clint and I have discussed a few times in the past, pertaining to how the Torah should be applied in Christian ethics, morals, and living. And then a third category would be kind of a miscellaneous grab bag of a few different topics that were asked about in the questions that were sent in. Before we get into the meat of the questions and our responses, I want to just give a few caveats here at the beginning. First of all, I want to say that not every question has a perfect answer, and that's why I've not labeled this show as Torah Q&A, because there are some questions that are maybe just questions that we will always struggle with, questions that we will debate and discuss, and people will find that they have differences of opinions about, and that's okay. As we are all doing our best to learn the Word of God, to know what has been revealed to us through Scripture better, we're always going to have more and more questions, and sometimes those questions will generate their own questions that will be even more difficult to answer. So instead, we're going to respond as best we can to some of your questions in this discussion. And I also just want to give one other caveat, which is that Clint and I are on this journey and have been through this journey through the Torah with you. And there have been questions that we ourselves have generated about the Torah and about how to read this portion of the Bible correctly, effectively, and in a way that's in keeping with its original context and historical setting. So I just want to lean into the fact that we are here journeying through this discussion with you, and so we really appreciate hearing from you and hearing what questions you have thought of along this journey with us. All right, Clint, the first kind of topic or bucket of questions that we want to discuss all have to do with interpretive issues. and not really with interpretive issues of the Torah in general, but specifically interpretive issues about what's sometimes referred to as the Genesis prologue. That'd be the first 11 chapters that lead up to the Abraham narrative, which then dominates the rest of the book, starting in chapter 12, continuing through with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph all the way to chapter 50. So in these first 11 chapters, we have the creation account of Genesis 1. We have another kind of creation narrative in Genesis 2. We'll talk about maybe the similarities and differences between them. The fall narrative in chapter 3, Cain and Abel in chapter 4, genealogies, the flood cycle. Then all of this leads eventually through the Table of Nations and to the Tower of Babel rebellion in Genesis 11. So the question really is, how do we view this body of text? And many different ideas have been proposed over the years, some from the fields of higher criticism, some from the fields of literary analysis, some from those who try to harmonize these texts with scientific and archaeological discoveries and things that have been learned throughout the ages by human ingenuity. So I guess just sort of start with a broad question, Clint. When we come to this part of the Bible, it doesn't seem like there's always a one-size-fits-all approach, and that there have been different approaches that people who have a high view of Scripture, who believe in inspiration, have tried to propose and utilize over the years that maybe come away with different answers to different questions. What's your sort of 30,000-foot overview of how to tackle this difficult issue?
Well, it's even at 30,000 feet, it's hard to describe it sometimes. Really, when you get to these sort of questions, the important matter is that we're not asking really, do we believe the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis? We're asking, how should the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis be read? What kind of literature are they? Are they prose narrative? Are they poetry? Are they something else? Some people have come up with a lot of something else categories over the years, and sometimes those categories have been developed through archaeological discoveries of other pieces of ancient literature that seem to have been written around the same time as the book of Genesis. And some people would suggest, well, Moses was using a literary type familiar to his readers, but one that's not particularly well known in modern days. Now, that might be an odd thing for some people to consider, but think of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is a strange book, no matter how you slice it. People who try to take it literally find it to be a strange book. People who try to take it symbolic find it to be a strange book. And it's generally been acknowledged to be a class of literature, to belong to a class of literature called apocalyptic, which was fairly common in the days when Revelation was written, but is virtually non-existent today. Nobody's writing apocalyptic literature now. So the same thing could be true of the book of Genesis. And that might mean, or at least Genesis 1 through 11. Most people think that at least 12 through 50 is prose narrative. But 1 through 11 might be something else, some people say, and might need to be read in a different way. And those different readings have allowed for different theories. And a lot of times these theories rise to popularity because they do seem to provide an out for controversies between the Bible and modern scientific theories that seem to violate a direct, very literal reading of the Genesis account. So you've got theories like the gap theory that says there's a space of time between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 where a bunch of stuff happens that Moses doesn't mention, but you can learn about it in other parts of the Bible. There's the day-age theory, that each day represents a long expanse of time, which is possible within the semantic range of the Hebrew word yom. It can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a long expanse of time. And some people say that it does there, and that it refers to different sort of what we would call geologic ages. And then there are other people who say, no, that's not really the right way to read Genesis. Instead, we should read it as sort of an epic legend that describes some ancient things that were real, although the way that Genesis describes it is legendary. And that's one of those suggestions of an sort of an ancient literary form. Other people say, no, it's written quite literally, but it's got a certain literary style that emphasizes the important matters we're supposed to be focusing in on. And if we don't do that and we focus on other matters, then we'll totally miss the point that this section of Scripture is trying to make. Now, these questions are not inconsequential. And I think I would just state that a few years ago, I began to reason through this issue like, how old is the earth? And was there a real Adam and Eve? These are questions people are asking today. And I thought to myself, does it matter how you answer this question? Whether or not you can be a Christian? Can you be a Christian regardless of how you answer this question? Now, that doesn't mean, even if the answer is yes, you can be, it doesn't mean that it's a meaningless question or unimportant or that there's no truth to it. It just means that it might not affect some of the central principles of the gospel. So, for example, the age of the earth. Now, does the Bible tell us how old the earth is? Some people say yes, and some people say no. And those who say no tend to accept that science says the earth is very old, and they think that's right. The earth is very old. Among the people who've thought that the earth was old are folks like J.W. McGarvey and Alexander Campbell and David Lipscomb and all those old restoration preachers. I don't know of any of those men who believed in a young earth. And yet, all of those men did believe the gospel. In fact, most of us learned the gospel from them or from their spiritual grandchildren, and we learned it the same way they preached it. So their belief in an old earth, even if they were wrong, did not prevent them from understanding the gospel. On the other hand, some of these theories say there was no real Adam and Eve, that there was no actual Garden of Eden or eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, no actual event in which humanity fell from a state of holiness and meeting the purpose for which they were created to a state of corruption, that instead, humans just evolved from lower biological organisms and moved up to a state that's basically where they are right now. And I think those are seriously problematic interpretations, because what we have seen in our study of the Torah is that the Torah tells a story.
Right.
And this story is the basis of the whole Bible. It's the basis of who Jesus is and why he came and what he did and what he's doing and what the end of it all is going to be and why we should live the way we're supposed to live in the midst of that story. And to say that the beginning of the story is fake and it didn't even really happen, nothing like it really happened, is to totally undermine the meaningfulness and value of the whole Bible, it seems to me. And I've heard a lot of people who tried to defend otherwise and say that it doesn't have that big of an effect, but I'm not convinced. Jesus took the Adam and Eve narrative, those early sections of Genesis, seriously enough. I mean, I would say literally enough that he based ethical teaching on it. He was asked, about marriage, and he said, well, didn't God say a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, the two shall become one flesh? God in the beginning created them male and female. He's quoting right from Genesis chapter 2, and he's using that to establish ethical, moral teaching. The Apostle Paul said, how should men and women behave in the church? Well, haven't you read about what happened in the Garden of Eden? The serpent deceiving Eve, and Adam was created first, and then Eve was created afterward. Why would anyone care if that was all just a mythic telling of something that actually it was nothing like that? Why would that have any ethical impact on my life? Why should that affect how I live? Instead, we should be looking beyond those details for the kernel of reality that's buried deep within them. But that's not how Jesus or the apostles handled the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so I think that any view that handles it that way is decidedly unchristian. And so there are, in other words, it's complex. It's complex
Yeah.
even at 30,000 feet. And maybe you have something you can say to sort of tie together what I've just shared.
Well, one point I wanted to draw out from what you said, I read a book a few years ago by John Walton called The Lost World of Genesis 1. And in that book, which I found, some points that Walton made interesting, and I found that there were some points that I felt that he stretched far beyond what the biblical text would allow. Walton's basic premise in the book is that he examines other ancient Near Eastern creation myths from the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Hittites, Ugaritic texts and the like. And he takes Genesis 1 and he sort of sides Genesis 1 alongside those other creation stories from these other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And he says the proper way to read Genesis 1 is to read it in light of what these other neighboring nations and kingdoms and people groups of the Israelites said in their own creation stories. And I think, there may be a time when that kind of an enterprise can be helpful and may illuminate certain points. But I fear that doing that then takes Genesis 1 away from what the biblical authors saw it as, which was not just a one-off creation myth to be compared to other ancient Near Eastern stories, but as the foundation of a larger biblical story that ultimately led to the coming of Messiah and the redemption of the world. And I think your point was exactly right. One thing I liked about Walton's book is that he encouraged Christians not to obsess about the apologetics of Genesis 1. And I think, I think that's probably right, because Genesis 1 was not written to be an apologetics text, but it was written as the basis of a story that had a direction in mind from the get-go. And that direction becomes more and more clear the further along you go until you finally get to Jesus. So to remove any historical foundation from the Genesis prologue would, I think, to me also undermine the credibility of that continuing story. So whether or not we think we should use Genesis 1 or the Genesis prologue as an apologetics text, in debating creationism versus Big Bang Theory or biological evolution or something like that. Okay, that's kind of an aside and totally a different issue here. The real question is, how does Genesis 1 fit in the biblical story? Seems to me that it fits in some pretty profound ways that make us want to ensure that we retain that all of those historical elements that seem to be the grounding of what comes for the next several thousand years after that, until we get to Jesus and the restoration of all things, as the Apostle Peter talks about. So I guess then another question would be, how should Christians respond when they encounter other believers who maybe hold views that eliminate any kind of historical moorings in these chapters? If someone can't be a Christian, as you've said, unless they affirm in a historical Adam and Eve, and if we meet people in our churches who don't believe that, how should we respond to that? I mean, I think that our listeners might wonder, is this, and I know this because one of them sent this question, is this a fellowship issue? Is it serious enough that we would have to say a person who believes that in one of our congregations could no longer be a member of our church because they believe in mytho-history or some other variation, some other maybe literary critical approach to Genesis 1 through 11 that removes any historical foundations? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, again, this is it's sort of a case-by-case thing in some ways. What I mean by that is that I have met people who would say I don't think Jesus believed in the historic Adam and Eve. I've met people who say that. Now, if somebody says, I think Jesus believed in a historical Adam and Eve and he taught things based on that, but Jesus was just wrong, that person is not a Christian. Now, that might sound like a strong statement, but a Christian is a disciple of Christ, and a disciple is not above his master. At the end of the day, Jesus either was a teacher of truth and we all ought to be his followers and learn from him, or he wasn't. And anyone who says Jesus said this, but Jesus was wrong, whatever that person is, they might be an admirer of Christ in some ways, but they're not a Christian, because by definition, a Christian is someone who learns from and follows after
Mm.
Jesus. And it's fascinating. Some people have dismissed Jesus as anything but a great teacher. These people are not even acknowledging him as that. He's not even a great teacher. That's a serious problem, I think.
Okay.
Now, if somebody says, "Well, I disagree," I think that we have the problem. We read Genesis differently than Jesus and the ancient Jews and the apostles and the original audience would have read it. And we have imposed some meaning on the text that wasn't there. Then I don't agree with that, but I think that calls for a discussion that is more of a challenging, something you've got to take the time to work through.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on the former, if somebody just says I reject the teachings of Jesus and I don't believe that what Jesus said was true, then no, that person doesn't have any place among the community of Christ's followers. So and there are people who say that. I mean, I've heard people
Right.
say that. I
Right.
believe Jesus believed in historical Adam and Eve. He was just wrong.
Mm.
If that's what you think, I don't know how you can be his disciple in any sense. But you're
Okay.
certainly not his disciple in the sense he wanted you to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's helpful, and that's a good way of stating it. Another kind of series of questions that are related to this with regards to interpretive issues about Genesis and about now maybe about the Torah in a more broad sense has to do with something that we have talked about before in the past, which is the idea that a number of scholars, a number of critical scholars, sort of parse the Torah out into multiple different sections that they say they believe originated from different competing sources. And so you have sort of three gradations of this. There's source criticism, which is the idea that we're going to try to figure out the original source texts of a Mosaic composition, like many scholars believe that the Torah is. You have form criticism, which takes that even a step further to say, okay, what was the original form of the source when the author received it and then put it into the compilation? So was it like we've talked about, was it a folk story? Was it a genealogical record that was handed down from generation to generation, things like that? And then redaction criticism, which is basically the idea that then whoever the editors were, the redactors, who compiled a mosaic or the source text together, how did they go about doing that? How did they make this sort of patchwork? And we, in the past, have rejected documentary hypothesis. In fact, a number of prominent modern scholars are basically not I wouldn't say necessarily wholesale dismissive of it, but don't really give it the credibility that documentary hypothesis once had in the scholarly world. And it seems like a lot more of the focus now is, okay, well, we have the text as it is in its final, this is the final form the text came to us in and was handed down through the community of the faithful. And so that's what is important. And whatever the sources may be behind it, however it came into this final form is a secondary issue. And that's, an interesting approach as well. But I want to just highlight something. So Clint and I have maintained our confidence that the overwhelming majority of the Torah was written by Moses. It's clear, especially the end of Deuteronomy and maybe some other places, that some later editing was done to the Torah. doesn't seem that Moses wrote about his own death or the things that happened immediately after that. We've talked about in the past how there are Persian words that are found within the Torah. It's very possible that some scribe in the post-exilic era updated some of the language to the audience that he was updating for and put new vocabulary words in to replace some of those outdated words that the people didn't speak any longer. So I think when we talk about different views of how the Torah came into being, we should, as Clint and I have tried to do, maintain what the Bible uniformly attests from the beginning all the way to the end, that this body of literature comes from Moses. But that doesn't deny the possibility that there was some editorial work that was done along the way. So when we talk about, for example, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, are these two portraits of creation. And I don't know about you, Clint. I don't know that I would put it quite that way. I think what I would say is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are offering a different point of emphasis about how and why God created what he created. That Genesis 1 is this prolific macro passage about the movement of God in speaking forth and ordering the universe and placing his image bearers on the earth to be his representatives. Genesis 2 seems to be much more concerned about the garden temple of Eden, where the image bearers would dwell, where they would work, where they would serve and minister in the presence of the Lord, and ultimately from where they would expand and fill the earth with the knowledge and glory of God. So it's not that we necessarily have two portraits of creation. I wouldn't word it that way anyway. I would say that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are offering 2 points of emphasis about the work that God did in creation. Would you kind of agree with that wording? Do you have some, maybe a little more specificity to add to that?
No, I think that's a good way of expressing it. Are you familiar with the Miss P ritual?
No.
Okay, so this was a few years ago. Some scholar of Sumerian history discovered a tablet or translated a tablet that had what's called the Miss P ritual. And it was that's, I guess, a Sumerian word, an Akkadian word, or something like that. And this ritual was performed by the ancient Babylonian people, where they would, when they made a god, when they made an idol, they would fashion the idol and they would have this ceremony where they would wash out its mouth and its eye sockets, and they would put it in a garden for a little while, in a sacred garden. And then when the time came to dedicate it, and it was all cleaned and ready to use, they would cut off the hands of the craftsman who made it and give this impression then that it had not been formed by men. It really was the God. Some scholar called it the incarnation of the God. That the ceremony was designed to incarnate the God and cause the statue to be the God. And the scholar said that even the ancients knew that men shouldn't be making gods, God should be making men. And in some ways, though, it's possible that the Miss P ritual was based on how God made Adam in the garden. God formed Adam and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and so on and so forth. And it's fascinating how you have these echoes or similarities in the ancient world. And some scholars are going to say that Genesis 2 is Moses using a Miss P ritual text format to tell a story. And that Genesis 1 would be using the temple text format to tell the story. That's what John Walton points out, that's like a temple text. It's also possible that what you've got is a story that survives to Moses, and Moses tells it, and this story had an impact on the whole world.
Right.
And there were people who borrowed elements of this story to tell their new story that they were making up since they had walked away from God, to try to give some more credibility to themselves. Yeah, they do know men shouldn't be making gods, so we're gonna make a god and then pretend that we didn't make him by cutting the hands off of the craftsman and so on and so forth. I just bring that up to say that there are, like we said before, multiple ways of reading these texts. It's possible that you've just got two ways of telling the story that would have had some meaning to the ancients. But I think if we let Genesis 1 and 2 speak just as we have them in the Bible as we have it, that the explanation you gave is the best. That you've got basically Genesis 1 focuses on God, and Genesis 2 focuses on humanity and humanity's role in creation. I think that that's a pretty good way of looking at it.
Well, good. Well, all right. So we're going to move on sort of to our next section here. I do want to acknowledge that someone sent us a question, and you mentioned the breathe into Adam's nostrils the breath of life passage there in Genesis 2, was it verse 7 or 8, something like that. And a listener did send us a question about that verse and about the idea of ruach, which is translated as spirit or wind or breath or something like that, different ways of rendering the word. And I want to acknowledge the question. We received the question, and we're not ready. I'm not ready to answer the question, because when I started to do a little digging on the kind of range of meaning that ruach can have, it just sent me down, all kinds of rabbit holes. It's one of those Hebrew words that seems to represent a lot of different thematic ideas and concepts. And so I hope that we can come back someday in the future and talk more about the meaning of the word ruach and how it relates to God's life-giving work, both for Adam and for the animals, and also, of course, for the ruach, the Spirit of God, hovering over the chaos waters and bringing forth order and life in Genesis 1, and how that fits in, with our understanding of the meaning of the word. So we're going to move on, though, to our next category, which is to, again, revisit a topic that we've discussed a few times. And I think it seems to be something that people are interested in, Clint, because maybe it's a new approach for some people to the Torah, to the law specifically. And that is questions relating to how laws in Torah apply to Christians. Do they? Don't they? If they do, how do they? If they don't, why does it seem the apostles sometimes think that they do? And how do we put that all together? So we've got a couple of specific questions about that. One is about the use of the word abomination, which is, I'm so glad that a viewer sent us this question, because we have not really talked about this word. And so we see this word appear a number of times in law sections where something will be called an abomination to the Lord, or just an abomination. And so we want to know, what does this word mean? And is the use of this word in certain moral texts an indication that that moral code, that positive law or that prohibition, has more weight behind it than maybe other moral rules that are given that are not called abominations or something like that? And maybe you could even give us some examples of that.
Okay, so this calls for us to refresh on our conclusion. I'm not going to go over all the different ways that people have treated the law of Moses, because that would take up a lot of time that we don't have. You can watch previous videos to see some of the different ways that people have handled the law of Moses as Christians throughout the years, and why we did not accept any of them. But the final approach that I haven't always thought of, and I didn't always even know it existed, but it makes sense to me, and it seems to be the way the apostles used the law of Moses, is what is sometimes called the pedagogical use of the law. Pedagogy means teaching. So the law of Moses has a teaching function. It is not an authoritative legislation. It's not our law, but it teaches us something very important. Now, that's not true of just part of the law, that's true of all of the law. Within this approach, though, there's some important principles to keep in mind. This approach was popularized. I don't know if it was invented. I mean, if the apostles used it, it was invented by them, I guess. But it was popularized recently by a scholar named David Dorsey. And David Dorsey made these observations to say that it is actually impossible for a Christian to keep the law of Moses today. He noted first that the laws are in many respects designed for a specific geographical area
Mm-hmm.
that most Christians don't live in. It was designed for a specific culture, particularly ancient Near Eastern culture, a long time ago, a culture that was agrarian and functioned in a very particular way that most
Mm-hmm.
cultures don't function. It was designed for a narrow religious environment, for people's interactions with the Canaanites and with their religions. And it often spoke to those particular interactions. It was designed for a specific nation that actually was able to control the lives of its people in a way that most nations today can't. It was designed for a worship system that has been superseded and is no longer available. There
Mm-hmm.
is no temple or priesthood or altar or sacrifice today. Even if people wanted to do it, they couldn't. Even observant Jews, Torah observant Jews, so claimed, they don't keep the Torah because it's impossible for them to, and they would admit that. Now, within those, so those observations are important, first of all. Uh, the second observations that Dorsey makes, which are important, are that the tripartite categorization, that means the threefold
Mm-hmm.
division of the law into moral, civil, and ceremonial, which I used to preach. I used to be convinced that it could be sustained, and I thought that this abomination word might support it. Really, when you study the law in detail, I don't think it can be sustained. I don't think that it's possible to clearly distinguish and say this law is moral as opposed to ceremonial, and this law is civil as opposed to moral, and so on and so forth. The 613, as most people count them, laws just can't be divided that way consistently.
Yeah, not I'll
So,
just add to that, not to
oh,
mention that that is something that we would be imposing over the text because there's nowhere in the text of the Torah
mhm.
itself that indicates this division ever existed,
That's
right? So
right.
that,
That's right. And
yeah.
when people try to preach it that way, they just sort of cherry pick and they say, okay, moral, moral, ceremonial, civil, civil, ceremonial, moral, civil, ceremonial. There's no continuity within a chapter or
Right.
anything like that. So here are some things Dorsey says you should consider. First of all, you should remember as a Christian that a particular law is not our law. We are not legally bound to follow the words that we are reading here. It belonged to a covenant God made with ancient Israel, and that covenant has been abrogated, and we were never under it anyway because we're not Jewish. Number two, the Christian should determine the original meaning and significance of the purpose of the law you're studying. What was the point for Israel? Why did God give it to Israel? If we want to understand it, we have to understand it that way if it is at all possible. Then we should ask, what does this law reveal to us about God and about his ways? This is really where it's starting to come out of history to us because the same God who gave that law is our God. And if he taught something about himself, then whatever he taught is still true because he doesn't change. His nature is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so if he taught something about his knowledge, his understanding of justice, of truth, of equity, of nobility and virtue, or of him and his own nature, then we're getting something now that is tangible for us to draw out and to learn from. And then you get to the question of implications. Uh, how do the theological insights gained from this individual law impact me living today under the new covenant? Now, if you think, well, what would that even look like? we know what it looks like because we see the apostles do it with don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. The apostle Paul says, well, this wasn't just written for oxen. The principle that a laborer is worthy of his wages taught in this law governs all life, and it even governs preachers and how they should be treated by the church, and elders and how they should be treated by the church. So this is an ancient law. The law is not binding on us that we have to use oxen. We can't use a tractor. It'd be inappropriate to interpret it that way, that we have to grow grain and we have to crush it, through a milling process that involves the treading out of the grain. And on top of all that, we can't put a muzzle on the ox. It simply means that when someone is working and putting out energy to expend, to a task, they deserve to reap the benefits of that task. That's justice.
Right.
And
Right.
in fact, we saw that's the principle of a lot of laws. It's just teaching us how to be just and fair and equitable. Now, when we talk about abominations, I don't know that the word abomination adds any weight to a law. It might tell us something about God when the Bible says something is detestable to Yahweh. Maybe it does. But even if that is not attached, the fact that God said not to do something might mean that anyway. I mean, I don't know if there's texts that say that adultery is abominable or lying is abominable, or I guess there are texts that say that God hates lying and hates liars. But I don't know that that word abomination is attached to every moral or ethical precept that is mentioned in the Old Testament. But when you see it, such and such a thing is an abomination to Yahweh, perhaps that is something to mark and to say, okay, God hates this. Well, let's look at Deuteronomy 22:5. Let's pull it up here and engage with this text. I want to look at 3 abomination passages and just sort of see how we would use them. Deuteronomy 22:5 is the one that was always argued about when I was young. Still is, I suppose, but I don't hear it argued about as much as I did when I was a teenager. And this text says, it's not up here yet. Okay, a woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on a woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. And some people would say, well, that text, whatever it implies about how we dress, everybody kind of got the sense it implied something and meant it meant something. But people would say, well, it doesn't matter because that's Old Testament and we're Christians. What we're learning is that's not a healthy attitude toward the Old Testament. This passage does teach us something about God and about creation, and it teaches something that we should take seriously. Do we take it seriously because the word abomination is in it? No. We take it seriously because we take all of God's revelations in the law seriously. We learn something from all of them, even the ones about oxen and grain.
Yeah.
If we learn something from the revelation about oxen and grain, how much more, perhaps we could say, from one like this that seems to be rooted in creation and the differences between men and women, and seems to reflect on, God's hatred and disgust for a certain kind of behavior. So
Right.
Deuteronomy 22:5 is a pretty straightforward statement that cross-dressing is wrong, and that statement is designed to teach something to Christians. Certainly if the ox and the grain one is, this one is. Let's
Yep.
look at one more. This is from Deuteronomy 23:18. Earlier today, I was having a Bible study and a man asked me if people who do evil things for a living, illegal things for a living, can give some of the money that they earn to a preacher or to the church, and can the church receive that offering if it comes from a person who does something that's evil or wicked? Is that okay for the church, the preacher, to take it and say, well, it's not the devil's money anymore, it's my money now, and I'm going to use it for good. Well, let's look at Deuteronomy 23:18. This passage says, "You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God for any votive offering. For both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God." You notice the little number 1 up there by dog says that this is a reference for a male prostitute. It's not saying if you sell a dog, don't you bring the proceeds of that sale. Now, cat is fine, goldfish is fine. Don't be bringing that dog money in here. It's talking about prostitution. And so we learn here that God finds it detestable for people to do evil things and then think that they can sanctify their evil deed by giving a portion of their earnings to him. I think that that principle is just as valid for Christians as it was for anyone else. The apostles, I think, would have used the passage that way. Now, we don't have to go to this one. I'm just going to rapidly explain. There are other passages like Leviticus 11:10, which talks about shellfish as something that is an abomination. And it has been pointed out that it doesn't say it's an abomination to Yahweh. It says it was abominable to Israel. Whatever, if there is a distinction between an abomination to Yahweh and an abomination to Israel, or if there's not, the point is that this shellfish teaching, it does teach something important to us. The shellfish were unclean, and we've talked extensively about the principle of clean and unclean
Yeah.
and what that translates to spiritually speaking. The law is not for us. Whatever the law meant to Israel, it doesn't mean that to us. This law is explicitly stated to have been abrogated by Jesus in Mark 7:19 and by God to Peter in Acts 10:15. And in Acts 10:28, Peter talks about the spiritual principle that the law taught and what he now understands about it as a Christian. And so I think that we just have to sort of rewire the way we look at it. We're not saying all the laws in the Old Testament, they're not binding on us unless the word abomination is in there. Then that law is binding on us. No Old Testament law is binding on us legally. But all Old Testament laws teach us something about God and about creation and about justice. What does Deuteronomy 22:5 teach us? Doesn't it just teach us that men and women are supposed to dress differently and that God finds efforts to obfuscate the distinction between the sexes in clothing detestable? That's what it teaches us. And
Yeah.
so we should live accordingly. Now, the other, did you quote me the one about tattoos and tell me to talk about it yet? Or
Sure. Yeah. Go for it.
okay, so what's this passage? It was one of our questions too, right?
It was about, yeah, this over here in Leviticus 19:28. This from the New American Standard says, "You shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord." And so basically the question, simply was, would this text, if we're looking at it pedagogically, would this text have any implication on whether or not a Christian could get a tattoo today?
Well, if we accept the pedagogical view, every text has some implication to us. Now, I've got a list here of some possible implications from this text. It could be, because the text doesn't tell us why God made this prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that he is commanding that they avoid a custom associated with paganism, or a custom associated with slavery, or to teach respect for living tissue, or to renounce exhibitionism, something about modesty, in other words, or to avoid the danger of making a forbidden image, something about idolatry, and it has more to do with the kind of thing you would get tattooed on you, or to prevent the spread of infectious diseases, something about hygiene. Some people think that God has a lot of instruction about hygiene in the law of Moses. Other people don't. But those are sort of debated issues we've talked about. I don't know. As I recall, when I studied this passage maybe a year ago or so, it does appear in a context that talks about magic and sorcery and witchcraft. And
Hmm.
so I think that when we're studying this way, it is important to look at context. Remember Dorsey's admonition. Before you ask how it applies to me, you have to ask, what did it mean to them?
Hmm.
And if what it meant to them was that you shouldn't engage in this practice that's associated with witchcraft and sorcery, then probably the application has more to do with the fact that we shouldn't be practicing things associated with witchcraft and sorcery than being a flat prohibition against tattoos. There may be New Testament teaching that suggests that Christians ought not to get tattoos, or maybe there isn't. But if you ask about the implication this passage has, well, it's a difficult passage in its original context, but you've got to work through that
Yeah.
before you can figure out modern day implications. I hope that's helpful.
I want to thank you, Clint, because and I've said this in previous shows. You introduced the pedagogical approach to me a few years ago, and I have found it, as I've considered it more and more, extremely helpful. And I appreciate you working through these couple of case studies. We've done this before on a previous show. We worked through a couple of case studies. And I think every time we do this, every time we go through this exercise, I'm helped more and more by seeing the process of how one would take some of these passages and try to bring out their, as we might say, application or relevance for Christian living today. So thank you very much for doing that. And I hope that if other viewers have more questions about this particular issue, and maybe have examples. How would you approach this passage? Or what do you think about this verse over here? Send that to us, and we'll do our very best to help with that. I see there's a pointing towards the book here.
A book
Oh,
recommendation.
yes.
A
Yes.
lot of we've talked about James E. Smith before. He's one of my favorite Old Testament scholars, and he wrote this book, The Ten Commandments Revisited, where he takes his hand at exploring the law of Moses through this pedagogical lens. I have found his book to be extremely beneficial. Other books like it have been written by people like Walter Kaiser, David Dorsey, I mentioned him already. And so there is a body of literature out there that explores the old law this way. And I've become so impressed with it the more that I've studied the New Testament and seen it really does look like this is the way the apostles used it. If it is, that how can we improve on that?
Very good. All right. Well, we've just got a couple minutes left here. We're going to maybe a little bit long in this episode, but I think that's fine because we're just trying to get through as many of these questions as we can. So the last sort of category of questions here, and there are just two we're going to deal with, have to do with a particular passage, both from Exodus, actually. And it's basically a question of observation. I think they're both very good questions, which is basically, what does this verse mean in light of what we know about the background? So the first is from Exodus 16. This is just after the Red Sea crossing. The Song of Moses is in the Song of Victory is in Exodus 15. And immediately after that, as the Israelites begin to walk for 3 days into the wilderness on the way to Sinai, they bring up a complaint against the Lord. And the complaint is, wouldn't it have been a lot better for us just to die in Egypt? I mean, at least back there, we had pots filled with meat, we had bread and to spare, and now you've brought us out here into this wilderness to kill us. And the question basically is, how does this objection, or how does this complaint from the people make any sense? Didn't they bring with them out of Egypt livestock? Could not they have just eaten the livestock and sustained themselves? Why were they so dramatic about their near-death experience as they perceived it? So I think there are two responses to this. One is that this just seems to be the way that Israel handles any problem they confront. at least this generation. Everything is dialed up to an 11. The complaining goes to the maximum right away. Everything is dramatic. Everything is a near-death experience. Everything is, we should have just died in Egypt, or God, you should have just killed us. Why'd you bring us out here? So I think, number one, that is just the mindset that these people seem to have. Number two, particularly about the livestock, I want to read just a very little excerpt here from Nahum Sarna's commentary on Exodus, where he directly answers this question. So here's what he has to say. Since the people left Egypt with their flocks and herds, they could hardly have been in danger of starvation. However, livestock is the most valuable possession of the pastoralist, who can seldom be induced to part with an animal. Besides, the people had probably also already suffered losses for lack of adequate pasturage. And so basically, Sarna says there were limitations based on their wilderness experience that would have made it difficult to maintain or grow livestock. Once you start to eat animals, if the animals aren't reproducing, you're going to run out. Okay, that's valid. And the second is just the way that livestock were valued and treasured. And so to just start going in and thinning out the herds just to survive would mean there's nothing left for the future. And they are anticipating, hopefully already, going to this land that God has been promising, and they want to have something they can bring with them. So there were maybe some limitations on the people with this respect, but I think you have to absolutely couple that with the overly dramatic kind of murmuring that the Israelites seem to be so wont to do. Do you have a comment on that, Clint?
Only to thank you for sharing that, and to just stress that this is a great example of responsible reading of an ancient passage of Scripture from another part of the world. The way we think about issues is shaped by the world we grew up in. The world we grew up in is very different from the world these people lived in. And so we might think, well, duh, if you're starving, kill some of these cattle. But they thought very differently about cattle than we, because they were an agrarian and pastoral society. So part of responsible reading is not just going to another place, but learning to think the way they thought, letting them speak on their own terms, and trying to understand the world that they lived in.
Very good. All right, so last question, Clint, and I'm hoping that you can help with this one. This question is based on Exodus 34, although what's stated in Exodus 34 is repeated a number of times throughout not only the Torah, but the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the rest of the Old Testament. This is that famous scene where God puts Moses in the cave, and he passes by, and he reveals or proclaims his own identity or some of his chief characteristics. And this becomes a formulaic way of describing Yahweh for the rest of the Old Testament. So let me read, and then there's a particular expression that's used that someone has asked about and asked if we can help to explain its meaning. So this is Exodus 34. This is halfway through verse 6. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. And specifically, it's about that last part, Clint, about visiting the iniquity of the parents upon children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. So I guess the most obvious question, the most basic question is, what does that mean? I will note that this formula, 3rd and 4th, seems to be a fairly common formula that is used from time to time, like when the prophet Amos talked about, for 3 transgressions and for 4. And so he would kind of go through this list of things that the various tribal groups had done to sin against God. He sort of used this formula. So 3rd and 4th kind of maybe seems to be a sort of a way that some of the prophets spoke, but particularly about the idea of visiting iniquity upon descendants. What does that mean? And does that imply some sort of inherited depravity that would be akin to maybe something that is taught commonly by Calvinists?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think that's what it means. That would be one way of interpreting it. Of course, that is not the Calvinistic doctrine of inherited sin, that it goes to the third and fourth generation. Does that say third or fourth? The third and fourth? Does that mean it doesn't go
Third.
to the second?
Yeah.
You see what I'm
Right.
saying? That if you're going to press this to literalism like that and try to build some doctrine out of it, it's going to be weird. And we're fine because we're more than four generations removed from Adam. So people have been doing pretty well with that original sin business for a long time. If that was the case, of course, I don't think that's the meaning. One possibility is that this is talking about God giving a generational curse. Some people talk about the concept of generational curses, that God becomes very angry with certain persons, and certain sins that they commit cause God to put a generational curse that has to either run its time or even be broken through something that subsequent generations do. I have never really been persuaded that that is a biblical teaching. I think that's something that comes from another source. Generational sin is certainly a biblical concept. There are things that people do that set their family down a bad road, such as Canaan or Ham. I guess we got to go back to Ham. Ham did his thing to Noah, and then, Noah says, "Cursed be Canaan, your son," and his offspring are going to be cursed. Well, why? Why was Canaan and his offspring cursed? Well, because they were like Ham. They
Mhm.
were sensuous, disrespectful, carnal, evil, ungodly people. And actually, they got worse and worse and worse as they went along, until finally they get obliterated because of their evil before God. So it's possible that that's the idea. It's warning that there are some sins that end up setting a family down the wrong road, and multiple generations will continue and be destroyed. But I think the context here lends to a different interpretation. That what he's talking about is prolonged consequences. Sometimes God punishes, and the punishments don't get resolved overnight. And they don't only affect the generation that sinned, but they affect other generations that follow. But really, the point is that God visits iniquity sometimes to the third and fourth generation. Third and fourth is a figure of speech, meaning the third even to the fourth, even as far as the fourth generation. But he keeps loving kindness for thousands. That's the contrast here. Yes, sometimes God punishes people, and the punishments are so grim that they have a lasting effect for three, even for four generations. And you think, what a cruel and vindictive God. But he says, no, he shows mercy for thousands. That's the point that I
Yeah.
think we need to be drawing out of this text.
Absolutely. That's great. And I would just add to that if you put this text alongside the trajectory of the history of the nation Israel, that does seem to be what commonly occurs. You'll have an apostasy that will last for a few generations, and then some great revivalist will come along, a righteous king or a Samuel-like figure or an Ezra-like figure who leads the people back to the Lord, and they maintain loyalty for a while, and then another apostasy comes along later down the road, and that seems to perpetuate for a few generations, and on that cycle kind of goes. But all throughout, no matter how many generations of apostates there were in Israel, God was still faithful to his promise. He never forgot what he said to Abraham. He never forgot about the blessings that would come through him to all the families of the earth. And God continued to work to bring that mercy, to bring that grace, and to bring his favor to all the human race. Well, listen, we are so thankful and appreciative of all those who sent in questions. They were very insightful. They were good questions, and I hope that we had meager yet sufficient responses to them. Now, as we close this episode, I just want to make an announcement about our forthcoming plans for the search now that we've completed the Torah. Clint and I plan to sort of pivot a little bit and start a brand new series on how to study the Bible. How to study the Bible. A lot of things that we have talked about as we have taken you on this journey with us through the Torah. I think what we want to do now is we want to pause. We want to synthesize a lot of that in a way that's easy to follow and digest so that you, our viewers, our listeners, can then take that same approach and not depend on us. You just go and you study whatever part of the Bible you want to study for yourself, for your own edification, for your own teaching. So that's going to be the plan for the next several, probably couple of months, that we'll be focusing on how to study the Bible. I'm excited about it. I know Clint is excited about it, and we hope that you are too. So stay tuned for more information about that, which we will be sending out pretty soon here as we're preparing for that new study. Thank you all so much for being with us. We appreciate you. We love you. God bless each and every one of you. We hope you have a wonderful night.